Testing, testing. All right. Ready to get started. All right, so we're talking about the integumentary system. Uh, it covers the body and it consists of the skin and the accessory tissues, such as nails, hair, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands. Uh, the integument refers to the skin, and we also call the integument or the skin, we call it the cutaneous membrane, consisting of the epithelial layer on top and the connective tissue layer below. All right. It is a barrier to the outside world, just like the plasma membrane. Just like the plasma membrane separates the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell, the skin separates the outside of the body from the inside of the body. All right. Uh, and it can also be used as a visual indicator of our physiology and health. If someone is overheated, often their skin will become reddened or sweaty. If they are cold or hemorrhaging, they may turn pale. Then dermatology is, of course, the study of the skin. Dermis refers to the skin. Well, it's a layer of the skin. Anyway, uh, so the layers of the integument are the epidermis and the dermis. All right, the epidermis consists of stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, remember stratified means multiple layers, and squamous means the cells are going to be flattened. Of course, the bottom layer is actually cuboidal, but we still say it's stratified squamous. Most of the layers, most of the skin is squamous. Then we have the dermis, which is made up of connective tissue. It is a thin layer on top of loose areolar connective tissue proper. And deep to that, deep meaning away from the surface, right? Deep to that is dense irregular connective tissue. Uh, all right, so the dermis is deep to the epidermis. Deep to the dermis, you will find the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis is technically not part of the cutaneous membrane. It is not part of the skin. Okay? And it is a layer of alveolar connective tissue and adipose. Your subcutaneous fat, if you look at your body and you find fat deposits laying around, that's the layer where you're going to find it is in the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. All right. And if we look at this cartoon picture, all right, superficially you can find the epidermis. Okay. You can find the epidermis. Now there are multiple layers to the epidermis. Okay, depending on which area of the skin we're looking at, there can be either 4 or 5. Most of the skin will have 4 layers. The area in the palms and on the soles of the feet will have 5 layers. All right. Deep to that, you find the connective tissue. Now, if you can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can. I think you can. If you can see it, I'm indicating the papillary layer of the dermis, which is composed of loose areolar connective tissue. Now, deep to that is the reticular layer of the dermis, and that actually doesn't have reticular connective tissue. It has um, dense irregular connective tissue. Now, you'll see that in the dermis there are a lot of accessory structures. Okay, the most prominent here are probably the hair follicles. Connected to the hair follicle here is the erector pili muscle, which helps stand our hairs up. When you are cold and you get goosebumps, it's because the erector pili muscle is contracted and pulled on uh, the the hair follicle to make the hairs stand up. It's not easy to see the hairs on humans. They're usually pretty thin and short, but cats, you can see their hair stand up sometimes, and that's because the erector pili muscle in their skin is pulled on the hair follicle to make the hairs stand up. It's very obvious in cats. All right, a couple other structures here. You can see here It's labeled a merocrine sweat gland. This is also called an eccrine sweat gland. And this produces that watery, salty sweat. And you can see it as a duct, which travels up to the body surface and dumps that watery, salty sweat out on the skin surface to help cool us off. Now, if it has a duct and it's secreting outside of the body, what kind of gland is it? Yeah, it's a exocrine gland. Okay. All right. What else do we see? We see a corpuscle here. All right. A couple corpuscles which are involved in sensation, sensing input in the skin. The ones located superficially are responsible for very light touch. The ones located deep in the dermis detect pressure on the skin, things like that. All right, you can see blood vessels running through under the skin, the veins and arteries with branches leading off into the tissue. Okay, and then capillaries up here. Let's see, what else do we see? The sebaceous glands. Here you can see the sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles and they produce sebum. The sebum is an oily production um, that's produced through holocrine secretion, which is where the cell is destroyed in the process of making the product. And the destroyed, broken down cell is the actual product that gets secreted. All right, and we produce that sebum, that oily secretion made up of dead, broken up cells, and we secrete it out onto the skin surface. Okay, and sebum is, again, oily. It produces skin oil. If you haven't showered for a couple of days, you notice your skin's kind of oily. That's because you've got an excess of sebum on the skin. And sebum is actually protective. It helps keep bacteria from invading the skin. It helps create a protective moisture barrier on the outside of the skin. Helps keep your moisture in the skin. All right. Good. And then deep to all that, you find the subcutaneous layer, which is where you find the subcutaneous fat. And I said a minute ago, if you look around your body and you see fat deposits, even if you don't see fat deposits, everyone has a certain amount of fat under the skin. In very thin people, it may be a very small amount, but everyone has fat under the skin in the subcutaneous layer. All right, so the epithelium of the skin is the epidermis, and it's made up of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized means these cells are producing and contain the protein keratin. Now, keratin is a very tough protein. You find it in not just the cells of the skin, you also find it in nails, you find it in hair, and you find it in things like a rhinoceros horn. So when I was a kid and I went to the zoo, I remember them saying that a rhinoceros horn was made of hair, and that's actually not accurate. It's made up of the protein keratin, just like fingernails and hair are. All right. So the 5 layers of the epidermis, from deep to superficial, we're going from bottom to top, okay, are the stratum. By the way, stratum means layer, right? So stratum basale, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. Okay. Um, Good. So B for basale, that's the basal or bottom layer. You can remember B basale, B bottom, that's the bottom layer. Next up is the spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and then the stratum corneum is the outermost layer, and it's the thickest, toughest layer, and it's composed entirely of dead cells, the corneum is. Uh, let's see. Layers 1 through 3 are composed of living cells. Cells are dividing in the stratum basale, and when they divide, the new cells get pushed up into the stratum spinosum, and from there they will eventually get pushed up into the stratum granulosum. All right. Then the stratum lucidum is present in skin of the palm of the hands and the soles of the feet. Um, the rest of the skin lacks the stratum lucidum. All right, so stratum basale, it's the deepest epidermal layer, and it's a single layer of cuboidal cells. You have keratinocytes here. You also have melanocytes between um, the two layers. And the melanocytes produce the protein called melanin, and then they pass it on to the keratinocytes. All right, now melanin, you probably know, is a skin pigment responsible for the different varieties of skin color that we see. Melanin is important because it absorbs ultraviolet light, and ultraviolet light is a form of ionizing radiation. And as such, ultraviolet light is responsible for creating skin cancer, most of the cases of skin cancer. And then, of course, we have tactile cells in the stratum basale, which can detect touch. All right, keratinocytes. These will be found in all the layers of the skin, and these are the cells containing or producing keratin. All right. Melanocytes, we mentioned, produce the protein melanin. It's a pigment, and then they transfer those pigment granules to the cells around them. All right. We haven't really talked about cancer, but just to get into it real quick, cancer occurs when one of the controls on the cell cycle are gone. The genes responsible for controlling the cell cycle, when we see mutations in them that make them stop working, cancer happens. The cells divide uncontrolled after that point. All right, and so ionizing radiation or UV radiation causes damage to DNA. And when you damage DNA, maybe you'll see an effect, maybe you won't, you know? I could walk out in the sun right now. I stand there for 20 minutes. I will receive DNA damage. Some of it will be repaired, and maybe some of it isn't. All right. And so every time we're exposed to the sun or any other carcinogen, we are taking a chance, and most of the time we can repair the damage, but every once in a while it becomes permanent. Where that damage is in the DNA decides what the effect will be. Maybe there'll be an effect, maybe there won't be, but if the damage is in a region, if it's in a gene responsible for controlling the cell cycle, that's when you get cancer. Skin cancer. Well, cancer in general, but we're talking about skin cancer here. All right. So anyway, the melanin absorbs that ultraviolet radiation and protects the DNA. Of course, it's not foolproof, but it helps. All right, then you got the tactile cells, specifically Merkel cells. There aren't very many of them, but they are sensitive to touch. Next up is the stratum spinosum, which has several layers of polygonal keratinocytes, which means they have kind of they're a polygon, but that's pretty vague. They have kind of a non-specific shape. They vary. They're daughter cells from the stratum basale that get pushed into this layer, and they are non-dividing keratinocytes, meaning they don't divide, and they're attached to each other by intercellular junctions called desmosomes. Remember the rivets that hold cells together. And then you have epidermal dendritic cells. These are the cells of Langerhans, and they are immune cells. They detect pathogens, and then they actually engulf pathogens and break them down, and then they will alert the rest of the immune system to their presence. Then you have the stratum granulosum, all right, where you can have a number of layers of keratinocytes here. All right, the keratinocytes are producing keratin. Okay, this is where they're producing keratin. Then we're going to see the nucleus and the organelles disintegrate, and the cells die. So we fill them up with keratin here, and then the nucleus will break down, and the cell will die. Stratum lucidum, it's called lucidum because you can see through it. It's translucent, and it's 2 to 3 cell layers thick, and it's found only on the thick skin, found in the palms and soles. The rest of the skin on your body, on your face, on your leg, on the back of your arm, that's all called thin skin, and it lacks the stratum lucidum. The cells of the stratum lucidum are filled with a translucent protein called elidin. Then lastly, the outermost layer is the stratum corneum, where we see 20 to 30 layers of dead cells that are interlocked with one another. Dry, thickened surface is protective against abrasion. That's when we bump into things, and infection. Basically, because there are so many layers of dead cells here, it's hard for bacteria to penetrate through them. All right, so again, those layers from superficial to deep, from bottom to top, are the stratum basale, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. Or if we go the other way with it, from superficial to deep, corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. CLGSB. And when I was a student, the mnemonic that we used was, and you're only allowed to use this if you're over 21. If you're not, you got to come up with another one, is come, let's get some beer. All right. CLGSB, come, let's get some beer, corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. And if you get confused about the directionality, always remember B for bottom or basal layer, stratum basale. All right. And again, lucidum is only present in thick skin. All right, so we mentioned thick skin found on the palms of the hands, soles of the feet. It has all 5 layers. It has sweat glands, but no hair follicles or sebaceous glands. Thin skin, on the other hand, lacks the stratum lucidum, but we will find sweat glands, hair follicles, and sebaceous glands. All the normal skin structures are found in thin skin. In thick skin, all you have are sweat glands. You can remember, of course, the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet do sweat. All right, here you can compare thick skin and thin skin. Over on the left, you can see the thickness of the stratum corneum. It's enormous. That's why we call it thick skin. On the right, you can see the thickness of the stratum corneum, and it's really quite thin. Right, that outermost layer. So, skin color is largely determined by hemoglobin, melanin, and keratin. Hemoglobin is the protein found in red blood cells, which binds to oxygen and carries it through the body. And because it contains iron, it has a reddish color. So it's what makes the red blood cells red. And when you have blood containing red blood cells containing hemoglobin, close to the skin surface, the skin will become more red. So when people are blushing, blood has rushed to the surface of the skin in their face. When people are overheated and they turn red, blood has rushed to the surface of the skin. And we do that because blood is hot, it carries the body's heat, and we want to get that heat close to the surface so that we can radiate that heat out when we're overheated. When you're cold, on the other hand, you will constrict the blood vessels that lead to the skin, and you will divert the blood away from the skin surface, and you will become more pale. Okay, and of course you do this because, again, blood is hot, and in cold environments, we don't want to radiate that heat out. We want to hold on to it for as long as we can. So we divert the blood away from the skin surface to keep our core temperature high. All right. Good. One other thing about alcohol we always need to mention here. Some people think that when it's cold out, drinking alcohol, especially whiskey, will increase your body heat and keep you warmer. And that's actually not true. What happens is alcohol causes the blood vessels in the skin to dilate, which increases the rate at which we carry blood to the skin surface. Now, of course, because all of the receptors for temperature are in the skin, you're going to feel warmer. But in truth, you're losing heat faster. You're actually getting colder. You just feel warmer because you're bringing hot blood to the skin surface. And that's where you detect heat. You don't detect heat from your core. You can't. You couldn't tell if someone froze your core. You know, as long as your skin was warm. Next up, melanin. Okay, melanin is that skin pigment we mentioned earlier. And so people vary not just in the amount of melanin they produce, but also in the types of melanin they produce. There are two types of melanin that can be produced. And so, your genetic background will determine some of that, how much melanin you produce and what types of melanin you produce, which gives us the variety of skin tones that we see. Uh, Interesting fact about melanin, though. Between people who have very dark skin and people who have very light skin, um, there's no difference in the number of melanocytes. Same number of melanocytes in both groups of people. Those are the cells that produce melanin. The difference is in how much melanin is being produced by the melanocytes. In people with very dark skin, the melanocytes are more active and they produce more melanin. One other thing about melanin. Oh, albinism. Right. That's uh, the the state of being an albino. Uh, in people who have albinism, melanocytes are unable to produce melanin, and so we get very, very pale skin. We also see white hair or light colored hair in some cases. Some people with albinism are partial albinos, and they're able to produce one type of melanin but not the other, and so you may see that they have very light yellow hair instead of necessarily white hair. Uh, Good. And then we've got carotene. And carotene is a yellow-orange pigment that comes from certain vegetables. We mention it here. If you eat an abundance of carrots, and by an abundance I mean really an excessive number of carrots, it can change your skin color and make it more yellowish orange. All right, so here in the cartoon, you can see a melanocyte producing those little granules of melanin pigment and passing that on to the nearby keratinocytes. We mentioned the sun's radiation produces UVA, UVB, and UVC radiation. The UVC rays are absorbed in the atmosphere and they don't reach the Earth. Sunscreens or sunblock blocks the UVA and UVB rays, and it can protect the skin if it's used correctly. But you need a high enough SPF factor. SPF is the sun protection factor. Sunless tanners can create tanned skin without using UV light. Remember, when you use a tanning bed, you are still getting bombarded with UVA and UVB rays. You're still getting bombarded with ultraviolet radiation in a tanning bed. There are a lot of reasons to not tan. Um, Really, the only reason to tan is if it's medically necessary, like if you have seasonal affective disorder or something like that. Sunless tanners, however, do not protect against ultraviolet rays. All right, so the dermis we mentioned is deep to the epidermis. We're moving down now. And it's composed of connective tissue proper. You find, again, loose areolar in the papillary layer, and you find dense irregular connective tissue in the reticular layer. There are going to be other structures present, such as blood vessels, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair follicles, nail roots, sensory nerve endings, and erector pili muscles. All of these are collectively referred to as accessory structures. And then lastly, you've got the papillary and reticular layers that make up the dermis. Well, I guess we've already mentioned that. All right, so the papillary layer of the dermis is superficial to the reticular layer. In other words, it's on top of the reticular layer. and it is immediately deep to the epidermis. It's right under the epidermis. Oh, by the way, one way to remember the difference between the dermis and the epidermis, epi means above, and so the epidermis is above the dermis, right? All right, so papillary layer. Yes, we mentioned areolar connective tissue, and it's named for projections of the dermis called dermal papillae. The word papilla, I believe, means nipple, and so these look like nipple-like projections up into the epidermis. So they interlock with the epidermal ridges to increase the area of contact between the layers. And this is important because the epidermis is avascular, whereas the dermis is vascular. And so all of the nutrients received by the epidermis have to diffuse through the dermis first. All right, so the reticular layer of the dermis is deep to the papillary layer, and it is the largest portion of the dermis, makes up most of it. And it's composed of dense, yes, irregular connective tissue. So, moving on, we've got a cartoon here, and they've peeled away the epidermis so that we can see the epidermal ridges on the bottom of the dermis. I'm sorry, on the bottom of the epidermis. And then on top of the dermis are those dermal papillae, which again are the nipple-like projections up. All right. And good. Good. Moving on. I think we've covered all of this already. So collagen and elastic fibers are oriented in parallel bundles at specific locations in the dermis. The bundles function to resist stress during routine movement. And then the orientation is indicated by lines of cleavage, and we have maps for these lines of cleavage. I think we've got one. Yes, we'll talk about that in a second. So incisions that are parallel to the lines of cleavage are more likely to heal quickly. They're also less likely to leave a scar. Incisions that are perpendicular to the cleavage lines are more likely to stay open or reopen due to elastic fibers that have been cut. All right, now if the skin is stretched beyond its capabilities, if it's just stretched too far, you're going to see some of the collagen fibers tear, and that will result in stretch marks called striae. Now, here we see the lines of cleavage, and so you see those blue lines. These represent the orientation of the elastin and collagen fibers in the skin in the different parts of the body. If you make an incision, if you cut into the skin along these lines or parallel to these lines, the incision will heal more quickly and it's less likely to leave a scar. If you cut perpendicular to them, as we see at the top image, okay, if you cut across them, in other words, it's going to take longer to heal, it's more likely to reopen, and it's more likely to leave a scar. All right. So something to keep in mind for surgeons. Surgeons. Uh, yeah. Anyway, moving on. Tattoos. So these are permanent images that are produced on the skin, and of course I mean, almost everybody's got tattoos these days. We're all familiar with this, but you have to inject the dye into the dermis. That is, into the epidermis is not sufficient. You have to inject it below the epidermis into the dermis in order for the tattoo to become permanent. Right, and the reason for that is that the epidermal layer is constantly dividing, right? The stratum basale is constantly dividing and pushing up, and then we're losing those cells and replacing them. So if you only put the ink in the epidermis, the cells that contain that ink would be replaced, you know. And that's kind of how it works actually with a henna tattoo is they last for about a month because the cells that have been stained by the henna dye are eventually replaced. All right. Good. It's usually impossible to completely remove a tattoo. Lasers can be used to break down the pigments, but there's often some remnant behind. Newer inks are available that allow for easier removal. There's also this balm out there called Wrecking Balm. I've always been curious as to whether or not it worked. I'm not saying go buy it, but I bet there's a YouTube video. We'll look that up later. Ah, good. So the subcutaneous layer, also known as the hypodermis, is below the dermis. Now, hypo means below, so the hypodermis is below the dermis. And it's not officially part of the integument. It's not officially part of the skin, but we do talk about it in the integumentary system because there's no better time to talk about it, I guess. And it's composed of areolar connective tissue and adipose. And let's be honest, for most of us, it's going to be mainly adipose. And adipose, again, that's your fat storing tissue. The adipocytes that make up the adipose tissue are the cells that store fat. All right, now, functions of the subcutaneous layer include protection as well as energy storage. We store fat there. Protection in the form of cushioning, and then insulation for the body heat. Okay, fat insulates the body. And it's also a common drug injection site. So when we use a hypodermic needle, we are inserting it into the hypodermis. We insert it through the epidermis, through the dermis, and then into the hypodermis. All right. And when we inject drugs or medicines or vaccines or anything like that down into the hypodermis, what happens is there's a lot of blood vessels, and it's able to diffuse rapidly into the bloodstream because it's highly vascular. There are a lot of blood vessels there. All right. Protection, we mentioned, protects the body, cushions it. Um, also against harmful substances and microbes. Extreme temperatures, but that's related to its role as an insulator, and also UV radiation. UV radiation can penetrate the skin. So we always talk about it in regards to the skin because the skin is frequently bombarded with it, but UV radiation is strong enough to actually pass through the skin and into deeper structures. And so the subcutaneous fat layer will actually partially block rays just because it's one more thing that the radiation has to go through. Uh, it also prevents the loss of water, also the gain of water. The epidermis is water resistant, but not totally waterproof. Um, but we do lose water through sweat and transpiration. Transpiration would be just evaporation through the skin, and sweat is evaporation off the skin surface. Again, we have an oil layer of sebum, which helps reduce the amount of water we lose directly through evaporation through the skin. Metabolic regulation. So the skin is also responsible for the production of vitamin D3, which is, well, okay. The production of vitamin D is a two-stage process. One step occurs in the skin, and the other occurs in the kidneys. Yeah. Calcitriol, or was it like 325 dihydroxycholecalciferol? It's full name, something like that. We shorten it to calcitriol. That's active vitamin D. It increases the absorption of calcium and phosphate in the gut. Helps us absorb those from the foods we eat. It also regulates blood calcium levels by increasing calcium absorption. What else about calcium? I don't know, I guess that's fine. All right, the skin is also responsible for secretion and absorption. So waste products can be secreted onto the skin's surface during sweating. They get out in the sweat. The skin will absorb some chemicals and drugs, but block others. It is selectively permeable in that regard. So I think we may have mentioned last time Nicotine. So nicotine is highly transdermal. If you spill e-liquid on your skin, you can absorb it through the skin. That's not ideal because you can administer a large quantity of nicotine that way accidentally. It's one of the reasons e-liquid is dangerous for children. I mean, they might ingest it or they might just get it on their skin and then they can absorb it through the skin that way. And of course, what might be safe for you, it might be an overdose for them. Uh, Most of the e-liquids you can buy at a shop are going to be at such a low strength that it's really only a concern if they ingest it. Uh, However, if you mix your own and you have concentrated pure liquid nicotine sitting around the house, that is dangerous even for you to absorb through the skin. So always wear gloves or whatever. What else? Oh, yeah. So we mentioned before the transdermal patches, the nicotine patches, and so nicotine we know because the nicotine patches work is transdermal. It can pass through the skin. Other things can't. So for instance, I think we mentioned collagen. Collagen is too large to pass through. It's also charged. It's a protein, so it's going to be charged. Too big to pass through the skin. All these creams containing collagen are too big, or rather, collagen is too big to get through. It just sits there on the surface of the skin. All right. What else do we have? Bacteria are usually too large to get in. They would have to eat their way through your skin. Um, they would have to actually digest your skin in order to get through. They can't just push their way in. Immune function. So yeah, we mentioned the dendritic cells. They are immune cells. They are actually phagocytic in that they can eat or engulf bacteria and fungi that arrive on the skin surface. Um, or rather, deep to that, like in the stratum spinosum. But uh, so they can eat those bacteria, but they're also involved in alerting the rest of the immune system that there's a threat present. Then we have temperature regulation. We mentioned the use of dermal blood vessels to move blood to the skin, where we can radiate that heat out, or we can conserve heat by diverting blood away from the skin surface. And you do that by dilating the blood vessels, opening them up to increase blood flow, or we constrict the blood vessels to close them off and divert blood away from the skin. And then, of course, the skin's really important for, you don't talk about it enough, but really important for sensory reception. So, when we talk about the senses, and we'll cover this at the end of the semester, but when you talk about the senses, often people talk about the five big ones. You've got sight, smell, hearing, taste, and I'm going to stop you right there. The fifth one is touch, but those four are all located in the head. Those are all special senses. Um, the general senses are all of the other senses distributed throughout the body. Some of them we're conscious of, and some of them we aren't. We'll talk about that all in the nervous system unit, but understand everything else you can feel is you're going to be feeling it for the most part from the skin. Almost all of the other sensory receptors that you're consciously aware of are located in the skin. And so that's going to be things like touch, pressure, vibration, heat, cold, and pain. Most of the pain you feel comes from your skin, or in most cases, most of the pain people feel comes from the skin. Uh, good, 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 good. So, yeah, skin very, very important for sensory reception. As I said before with the whiskey example, when you drink whiskey, you feel warmer, but you're not actually warmer. You only think you're warmer because hot blood is being delivered to the skin, and that's where you have temperature receptors. You have heat receptors. Um, so you feel warmer, but you're actually not because you are eliminating heat more quickly. You're radiating it out into the environment. All right. You're actually losing heat faster that way. All right, so nails next up. So we have the structure of nails. They are scale-like modifications of the stratum corneum. So these are going to be layers of dead keratinocytes. The back edge, okay, so the dorsal edge is seen on the fingers and toes, and they protect the distal tips of the fingers, right? The ends of the fingers, in other words, and they assist in grasping some objects. The free edge is the white part at the end. The pink part is the nail body, and then the nail root is going to be embedded in the skin. These three parts together form the nail plate, which is what you would probably normally think of as the nail. The nail bed is the layer of living epidermal cells that are covered by the nail body. Do we seriously not have a picture? Oh wow. Uh, so I guess you can picture those parts. You've got the free edge, the white part at the end. You can even look at your hand now. The free edge at the end, that's the white part that we cut off with nail clippers. The pink portion of the nail is the nail body, and then the nail root is the portion below the skin. And then deep to the nail itself is the nail bed. That's where you find the living epidermal cells that produce the nail. So the hair is found almost everywhere on the body, not in thick skin though, only in thin skin, right? Remember thick skin, that's on the palms of the hands and the soles of your feet. And it's made up of keratinized cells, which form a slender filament called the hair. And it grows from hair follicles. There are three types of hair. Lanugo is a fine, unpigmented, downy hair that appears in the last trimester of pregnancy. So, not on the mother, of course, on the fetus. And I use the term uh, fetus there. A lot of people object to that word because it's very political, but just biologically, the definition is the first 8 weeks are the embryonic stage. The from week 9 until birth is the fetal stage, and then at birth you have a baby. So that's why I use the term fetus there. That's just by definition. I don't want to offend anybody. Just that's the definition. Anyway, lanugo is that fine, unpigmented down here that appears on the fetus in the last trimester. The vellus is a fine hair. It's the first human hair to form on the baby, and it's found on the upper and the lower limbs. Terminal hair is a coarser pigmented hair that will be longer, and you find that on the scalp, the eyebrows, the eyelashes, and of course in men's beards. During puberty, it replaces the vellus hair in the axillary and pubic regions. That is, axillary, remember, is the armpit. All right, so the hair structures and follicles have three zones along the length of the hair. There's the hair bulb, which is at the base, and that's where the hair originates in the dermis. And it surrounds a hair papilla, which is made up of connective tissue. And it's the only region that contains living epithelial cells. These cells divide, and when they do, they push the new cells up, and then eventually those cells will die and become part of the hair. The root is the zone of the hair that runs from the bulb to the skin surface, and then the shaft of the hair is the portion of the hair that you can see outside of the skin. So hair has a hair matrix, which is the structure at the base of the hair bulb. That's where we see the epithelial cells dividing. Again, as we said, the new ones get pushed up toward the surface, and they will eventually die and become part of the hair. We have the medulla, which is the remnant of the matrix, the flexible, soft keratin. Then you have the cortex, which is the flattened cells that are closer to the outer hair surface. We're going to see these terms medulla and cortex throughout anatomy and physiology. Medulla usually refers to the inner structure of a thing and cortex to the outer. That's not always the case, but there are a number of organs like the adrenal glands, the kidneys, um, the brain. They have an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The brain's maybe not the best example because they're located in different regions, but the adrenal glands, the renal glands, the ovaries, they have an outer cortex and an inner medulla. So we see that again here in the hair. There's an outer cortex of flattened cells that's pretty hard, and then the inner portion is the medulla, made up of flexible and soft keratin. And then lastly, you have the cuticle, which is a single layer of cells that surround the cortex. All right, so the hair components continued. Yes, we have the hair follicle, which is the tube that surrounds the hair root, and it extends into the dermis from the epidermis, and sometimes deep down into the hypodermis. There's an outer connective tissue root sheath that originates in the dermis and it surrounds the hair follicle. And it has an inner epithelial tissue root sheath that comes from the epidermis. Then lastly here we have the erector pili muscle, which is that thin ribbon-like smooth muscle that when it contracts it pulls the hair up, and when it contracts it's responsible for quote-unquote goosebumps or goose pimples. All right, so here we can see the root itself. The deepest portion is the hair bulb. Okay, this middle portion is the root, and the root runs from the bulb up to the skin surface. And then outside of the skin, we have the hair shaft. Okay, the hair shaft is the portion that we can see from the outside. Now, in the hair itself, you can see this inner layer called the matrix, which is producing, that is the living cells that produce hair in the hair bulb. They divide and they push up new cells to become part of the hair. They push the hair out, and that's how hair grows. In the hair follicle, you can see the connective tissue. Well, here's my cursor. Connective tissue to the outside, to the inside. You can find the epithelial root sheath, and they surround the hair. In the hair itself, you have the outer layer called the cuticle. That's one cell layer thick. Deep to that is the cortex, and then at the very center is the medulla. And the cuticle and the cortex are fairly hard. The medulla inside is soft and pliable. Then lastly over here we have the erector pili muscle, which pulls on the hair follicle to make the hairs stand up. And then just while we're on the topic, you're also going to find with the hair follicles, right here is a sebaceous gland, and the sebaceous glands secrete their product into the hair follicle, and then it comes through the hair follicle out to the skin surface. All right. So the functions of hair include protection. It covers the skin and not only partially protects it from physical abrasion, but also can block sunlight if it's thick enough. It can be used for facial expression in the case of the eyebrows, also heat retention, particularly on your head. All right, sensory reception. We can detect when bugs are crawling on us because they touch the hairs, and that activates receptors in the dermis. And then visual identification. We can identify people by their hair. And then chemical signal dispersal in the case of pheromones, particularly in the axillary region. So that axillary, that armpit hair. Then, so sweat glands and sebaceous glands. Sweat glands, there are two types. We've got the merocrine, also known as the eccrine sweat glands, and we have the apocrine sweat glands. The eccrine sweat gland is a type of sweat gland that uses merocrine secretion. different textbooks are going to use different words, but uh, eccrine sweat glands use merocrine secretion. In fact, let me go ahead and just edit that right now. Eccrine sweat glands use merocrine secretion. Apocrine sweat glands use apocrine secretion. That's easy to remember. That one's easy to remember. All right. Now, apocrine sweat glands are only going to be found in the axillary and inguinal regions. So the armpit, the axillary region, and then the inguinal region is the region between your thigh and your pubic region. It's also known as the groin. Okay. And so they're primarily located in those two areas. You won't find many of them in other parts of the body. There can be some distributed around, but there aren't going to be a lot of them, just a couple. You will sometimes also find them in the perianal region and the inframammary region. All right, so merocrine sweat glands, also known as eccrine sweat glands. Remember merocrine secretion? That's the one where uh, vesicles are carried to the apical surface of the cell, and then we just dump out the contents of the vesicle. That's the secretory product. And they're used to make that watery, salty sweat that cools the body. All right, so they have their own coiled tubules that lead to their own ducts that carry their product out to the skin surface. So they're not associated with hair follicles. They can secrete their product directly onto the skin surface. Good. So it's mostly water, 99%, but 1% is other stuff, including electrolytes such as salt, but also metabolites and waste products. And of course, its main function is in thermoregulation, or in other words, regulating body temperature. Apocrine sweat glands also have coiled tubular glands, and they have a duct, but their duct leads to a hair follicle, and so their product will be secreted into the hair follicle. All right. Good. So they produce their product through apocrine secretion, which is where we pinch off the top part of the cell. Remember, it is partially destructive, semi-destructive, because part of the cell is destroyed, but not all of it. And that pinched off cell portion becomes the secretory product, and it's a sort of viscous, sort of oily secretion that contains a lot of proteins and lipids, and it produces odor when it's digested by bacteria. That's why your armpits and your groin stink, is because the apocrine glands are producing apocrine secretions that are digested by bacteria, and the bacteria release gases that give you that scent. Now I say the word stink. Today in modern society, we think that armpits and groins stink, and that's why we need to wash them and apply deodorants and all this. But first, I mean, it's totally natural to smell that way, and a long time ago in human society, we used those smells to identify each other, and yeah. Anyway, whatever. Some people call them the human scent glands because they do give you your scent. All right, now they start producing their secretions during puberty. Okay. Sebaceous glands. These are holocrine glands. Holocrine secretion is a destructive form of secretion, and so the cells will be destroyed as part of the secretory process. And the destroyed cells, though, that's the secretory product. That's what we're secreting. The production, what we produce, is known as sebum. Sebum is used as a lubricant for skin and hair. It is bactericidal. It can kill bacteria. And it is discharged from the hair follicle. Basically, the sebaceous glands secrete their product directly into the hair follicle, just like the apocrine glands do. Their secretion can be stimulated by hormones, especially androgens, and they are also activated during puberty. Um, bu- 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 Before we move on, I guess, sebum is that oily production again on your skin surface while your skin's oily, your hair's oily, and we wash it away. And um, obviously, I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's not natural, right? So that oil is actually supposed to be there, and it is protective for people. It kills the bacteria. It helps prevent them from getting into the skin. It helps prevent us from losing moisture. It protects the hair, keeps it from breaking. Um, yeah, so it's natural. And it is super ironic that we wash it away every day with a shower, and then what's the first thing? Well, what do you do toward the end of the shower is you put conditioner in your hair, and conditioner restores the oil to your hair. We washed away our oil only to put more in. Then we get out of the shower and we put on lotion, which replaces the oil layer on our skin. You hear this word with lotions all the time, moisturizer, right? They moisturize, and they don't actually do that because water and oil don't mix. This is a product that's mostly made of oil. And what it's doing is it's restoring the oil layer, which prevents moisture in your skin from escaping. Okay, so you're replacing your oil layer that you washed off with a new oil layer. And then it gets even weirder because a lot of lotions and other products contain something called lanolin, which is sebum that came from sheep. And so we're washing away our own sebum only to replace it with sebum from a sheep. It's uh it's a weird world we live in. All right. So, next up, other types of skin glands. You have the ceruminous glands and the mammary glands, and these are modified apocrine glands. Both of these are modified apocrine glands that use apocrine secretion. The ceruminous glands are located in the external ear canal, and they produce cerumen, which is ear wax. Now, cerumen is a mixture of that oily apocrine secretion and dead skin cells. They mix together to make the secretion sticky, and that's what makes earwax. Yeah, sticky. It's a mixture of that oily secretion and dead skin cells. And it helps trap foreign particles, helps keep things from invading the ear. All right. Then we have the mammary glands, which are also modified apocrine glands. They're located in the breast, of course, and they only function in pregnant and lactating females. Well, technically, they only function in lactating females, right? Um, all right. So anyway, they're not active until pregnancy has occurred. All right. They produce milk. All right. So here we see the skin glands. Over on the left, you have an eccrine or merocrine sweat gland. Okay. And it has its own duct that leads to the skin surface. It is not associated with the hair follicle, and it produces that watery sweat. Another way to remember that maybe is there are no hair follicles on the palms or the soles, right? But the palms and soles do sweat, so they do have these merocrine or eccrine sweat glands that are not associated with hair follicles. Over on the far right, you have an apocrine sweat gland, which actually looks very similar under the microscope to an eccrine sweat gland. It's made up of these coiled tubules down here, and that leads to a duct, but its duct does lead to a hair follicle, and so apocrine glands will secrete through a hair follicle out into the skin surface. I believe the ceruminous glands will as well. Mammary glands, however, have a vastly different structure, and so we'll cover that in the reproductive unit. And then lastly, you see the sebaceous glands here, which are also associated with hair follicles, and they produce that oily sebum that travels up to the skin surface through the hair follicle. Lastly, I just want to reiterate, sweat glands include eccrine or merocrine and apocrine. All right. Apocrine sweat glands are not found everywhere. They are mostly concentrated in the armpits and groin. Uh, Eccrine or merocrine glands not associated with the hair follicle. Apocrine and sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles. And lastly, sebaceous glands are not sweat glands. Okay? Apocrine and merocrine are sweat glands. The sebaceous gland is not. All right. And the sebaceous gland will be found anywhere there's a hair follicle. Acne, also known as acne vulgaris or common acne, results from a plugged sebaceous duct, and it typically begins during puberty when the sebaceous ducts become active. The sebaceous glands become active, and we see increased activity of glandular secretions, which may block the pores. Treatments include benzoyl peroxide, salicylic acid, antibiotics, vitamin A like compounds, and systemic retinoids. And it can lead to scarring if untreated, especially if you pick at it. Don't ever pop or pick at a pimple unless you're Dr. Pimple Popper. All right, so repair and regeneration of the integumentary system. So the tissue is repaired in one of two ways, through regeneration or fibrosis. Regeneration is the replacement of damaged or dead cells with the same cell type, and it restores organ function. Fibrosis is where we see gaps get filled in with scar tissue, and the collagen is made by those connective tissue cells called fibroblasts. And then the functional activities of the tissue may not be restored. So for stages of wound healing, first, cut blood vessels will bleed into the wound. This blood washes out the wound. It helps push bacteria out, so a little bit of bleeding can be good. Also, it brings in white blood cells, which will attack any pathogens that manage to make their way into the wound. And then we will see a blood clot form, and that forms a scab which covers the wound and forms a temporary barrier for the pathogens. A scab is a blood clot. So that the blood clots and it covers the wound and it keeps pathogens, bacteria, and other stuff out. Then the blood vessels will regrow, and we see the granulation tissue form. Vascular connective tissue initially forms in the wound. And then we see the epithelium regenerate, and the connective tissue fibrosis can occur. So here we see the wound. We've had, let's say, a splinter. A splinter entered the skin. It's been pulled out. We damaged some of the blood vessels, and so blood enters the wound. First off, if you don't see blood, then you haven't damaged blood vessels, right? The blood never leaves blood vessels unless they are ruptured, right? All right. So when you scrape your knee and you don't see blood, you probably only scraped the epidermis, probably did not scrape the dermis, because the dermis has a lot of blood vessels. If you do see blood, then you've scraped the dermis. All right, and we'll see that blood leave the ruptured blood vessels and enter the wound. Now that's good because the bleeding pushes out bacteria. It also brings white blood vessels to the site. I'm sorry, white blood cells to the site that will attack pathogens. And then we get that clot to form, and the clot is a scab that is a temporary cover, covers the wound, prevents pathogens from getting in. All right, allows the white blood cells to come in and just wipe out the remaining pathogens inside the wound. All right. We see that here with the macrophages. Okay. Anyway, then we are going to see regeneration of the epithelial and the connective tissue layers. Fibrosis occurs when the dermal fibroblasts produce collagen that fills in the wound. All right, and then we will see regeneration occurring, completing here, where the tissue layers have replaced uh, the damaged. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Where the regeneration is complete when we've filled in the space with either new cells in the case of the epithelium or new fibers in the case of the dermis. Now, you may be able to tell in the cartoon here that the new fibers are not necessarily oriented in the same direction or with the same thickness as the other tissues. And so this fibrosis, this development of the thick collagenous protein in this region may result in a scar. All right, so psoriasis, clinical view, psoriasis. It is a chronic autoimmune skin disease. Here, the keratinocytes are attacked by T lymphocytes, and it causes a rapid overgrowth of the new cells. Basically, the stratum basale in particular is under attack, and it responds by dividing too much. All right, we'll see division of the stratum basale in regions that aren't necessarily under attack. All right, and that results in patches of whitish, scaly skin on the epidermal surface because, again, these cells are dividing too much in response to the attack by the T lymphocytes. Symptoms include severe itching, pain, and skin cracking. You can treat it with corticosteroids. Steroids, in general, reduce immune function. This is an autoimmune disease where the immune system has targeted keratinocytes for destruction, and so we can treat it by turning down the immune system, and we can do that with steroids. You can also use UV light therapy to reduce the activity of the epidermal cells. Basically, start killing them off. And then use medications that interfere with skin cell production. All right, so clinical view now, burns. They are a major cause of accidental death, and they're caused by heat, radiation, chemicals, sunlight, electrical shock. And the biggest threat to life in regards to a burn is the loss of fluid in severe burns, but also infection. So we've mentioned the skin is a barrier to the outside world, and it not only locks your moisture inside, but it keeps bad things from getting in, such as bacteria and fungi and viruses, most of the time. And so when we burn the skin, we've damaged usually a fairly large area of the skin, and so water can escape through the wound, and bad things, the pathogens, they can get in. With a first degree burn, this involves only the epidermis. So you see slight redness and pain. You can immerse the burned area in cool water. A sunburn, for instance, is an example of a first degree burn. If you lightly burn your skin on the stove, you touched something that was too hot, your skin turns red. You can treat it by running it under cool water, putting ice on it. All right, second degree burns involve both the epidermis and part of the dermis. And here the skin will blister. All right, you can tell it's a second degree burn when you see a blister. It'll be very painful. I mean, there are bigger pains in life, but it's pretty painful, and you'll get some slight scarring. Then third degree burns involve the epidermis, the entire dermis, and part of the subcutaneous layer, and they require hospitalization. You have to treat for dehydration because, again, you can lose a lot of fluid through these wounds. Also, infection. You've basically opened, when you suffer a third degree burn, your skin is open to the outside world. You will require additional caloric intake. In other words, you will need more calories because your cells are going to be hyperactive trying to close this up. And you will see severe scarring as we have to replace not just the epidermis, but the entire dermis in this region, all of the fibers in that region. And it may require debridement, which is removal of necrotic tissue, removal of dead tissue, and may also require a skin graft, either from a different part of your body. Say you burn your arm or your face, they can take some skin off your thigh or butt and move that up. You can also do artificial grafts in the short term. Yeah. The artificial grafts are mainly for closing up the wound and preventing loss of fluid and infection, but they're not a long-term solution, really. Not yet. And then burn severity can be measured using the rule of nines, which is used to estimate the surface area of burns. Wait, we don't have a picture of the rule of nines? Oh no. All right. We don't. I'll have to pull one up. In fact, I'll do that right now. All right, rule of nines. So let's pull this up. Each region of the body is worth uh, roughly 9%. So the anterior arm and the posterior arm are worth 4.5% each. So the entire arm is worth 9%. All right. Um, good. Each leg, front or back, is worth 9%. So for a total of 18%. All right, and so this is used to estimate how much of the body has been covered by wounds, also how much, um, and then we use that number to figure out how much fluid to administer. And so um, each region of the body is worth 9%. The entire head, the uh, all right, so the entire head, the entire arm, each arm is worth 9%. The front of the torso, 18%, back 18%. Legs, 9% in the front, 9% in the back for each leg. And then the genitals are 1%. That brings us to 100%. All right, so if you suffered wounds to the front of your arm and the front of your chest, that would be a total of 27% of your body has suffered burns. All right, moving on. Okay. So skin changes with aging. Of course, we know it does change with aging, changes quite a lot. We'll see reduced number of active cells and we'll see reduced activity of stem cells. As the population of stem cells that divides to create new cells begins to dwindle as they die off, we'll see that skin repair is slow, and we'll see that the thin skin is less likely to protect us from trauma. You'll see fewer collagen fibers in the skin. The elastic fibers will lose their elasticity, and we'll see the formation of crease wrinkles, crease lines, also known as wrinkles. The immune response will be decreased due to fewer dendritic cells. Dendritic, by the way, that's another name for the cells of Langerhans found in the skin. Those are the immune cells in the epidermis. And then the hair follicles will produce thinner hair or none at all. Some of us will go bald. All right, and then UV radiation. We see damage to the DNA in the epidermal cells will accelerate aging by killing off the population of stem cells that divides to produce skin. And this is the predominant factor in skin cancer, of course, is UV radiation. Skin cancer is the most common type of cancer. And it's typically found on the head and neck, which are maybe the most exposed areas. And then fair-skinned individuals are at the highest risk because they have the lowest amount of melanin, and melanin, of course, absorbs some of the UV radiation. Does it protects the DNA. It helps protect the DNA. It can't capture 100% of the UV radiation, but it captures some of it. All right, so Botox can be used to treat wrinkles. And it is a toxin derived from Clostridium botulinum, and it paralyzes the muscles of the face, blocks the nerve impulses to the muscles, so it prevents them from contracting, and it will decrease or eliminate wrinkles. Botox is injected into specific facial muscles, but it has a temporary effect that will wear off over time, and the muscles will regain function, and the procedure must be repeated. if you wish to achieve the same result. All right, well, that's it for the integument. Thank you very much. And if you have any emails, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.